Since the re-election of Donald Trump, advocates for the repeal of the U.S. income tax have found hope. Not only has Donald Trump promised to end income taxes on Social Security, tips, and double taxation for Americans abroad, but he has gone further, indicating on the Joe Rogan Experience that the income tax was a very stupid thing whose passage was ensured by foreign interests. Donald Trump said import tariffs could replace the IRS. Now, the other meaningful proposal comes from my friends over at FairTax. They have an idea of a 23% sales tax on new goods and services. The FairTax folk claim that this excise tax will end the IRS and bring on a new era of prosperity. So what's a better replacement for the IRS, tariffs or the FairTax? Hi, I'm Anthony Parent. I am a 20-year tax attorney, constitutional scholar, and host of the IRSMedic podcast, and I invite you to stay until the end of this video to learn the surprising conclusion. So first, let's get into it. Let's talk about Donald Trump's tariff proposal. President Trump has suggested imposing a universal tariff of 10% on all imports and a significantly higher 60% tariff on goods from China. He has also discussed potentially increasing tariffs on electric vehicles or applying high tariffs across the board. First problem is that tariffs is that they will not generate enough revenue to replace the IRS's current revenue collections. Now, look, I don't think this is a bad idea myself, as I would prefer to see the government smaller and Americans freer. But for the status quo, tariffs simply cannot raise enough to support the federal government. Consider in 1862, Abraham Lincoln imposed the nation's first income tax, it was temporary, in order to support his war effort against the South. Because the fact is, the war could not be funded by imports tariffs levied on the states remaining in the Union. Now, the second massive problem with tariffs is that tariffs can be used to harm certain people and reward other people. The powerful get to write the laws. For instance, in 1825, protectionist tariffs would have benefited the northern industrial centers were proposed. They imposed a 25% tax on all imported goods. Now, these tariffs were so awful, they were referred to as the tariffs of abomination. Consider the outcome. The southern states, which relied heavily upon imports due to their agricultural-based society, would essentially be paying for the entire federal government. Meanwhile, northern interests would receive most of the benefits of federal taxation. Import tariffs protected Yankee industrial interests and additionally forced the South to foot the bill for most of the government. Now, luckily, the tariffs of abomination were not enacted, South Carolina did not secede, and President Andrew Jackson formulated a compromise. However, decades later, the newly reformed Republican Party had their political power to enact the Morrell tariffs, which, like the tariff of abominations, had a flat 25% tariff rate. But the Morrell tariffs went even further and taxed any imported product containing steel, like farming implements, at 50%. To sweeten the pot to get the South to agree to these outrageous tariffs, the newly elected Abraham Lincoln offered the South the Corwin Amendment, an amendment that would protect the institution of slavery. All the South needed to do was pay the tariffs, and Lincoln would forever enshrine slavery into the U.S. Constitution. Yet the South refused Lincoln's offer. So we are left to conclude that maintaining the institution of slavery was not as important an issue to the South as ending ruinous tariffs. The third problem we have with tariffs is we have them already. Here is the harmonized tariff schedule. And currently, it is incredibly complicated and difficult to decipher. So tariffs can't offer much in simplicity or fairness. Yet perhaps the most damning thing is this: the American people were promised that in 1913, that the modern U.S. income tax would eliminate the need for tariffs. Well, that's kind of funny. We have an income tax. We also seem to have tariffs, in addition to a government unashamed about lying to us repeatedly. According to the harmonized tariff schedule, here are the tariffs for sugar and chocolate. These tariffs are the real reason behind the proliferation of high fructose corn syrup into the American diet. Tariffs make cane sugar too expensive, removing it as a choice from the marketplace. Do we want less choice in the future? So maybe tariffs can't be the way out, as they already exist, and expanded tariffs led to the greatest bloodshed this country has ever seen due to how punitive they can be to some. So then let's discuss the FairTax. Look, I like the FairTax guys. I think they mean well. I've had them on as guests, and I've been a guest on their podcast. I agree the IRS is abusive and change is needed. The FairTax proposes a 23% sales tax rate applied to all new goods and services sold in the U.S., but the tax is only payable by people above the poverty level, so it is claimed not to be regressive. But here's the main problem. Like tariffs, excise taxes have already been enacted and have a history of abuse. In fact, the very first excise tax, the excise tax of 1791, imposed a ruinous sales tax on whiskey that affected rural parts of the country and was barely felt by the industrial East. The whiskey tax, like the Morel tariffs, had only certain people paying for the federal government, and then that federal money was given to others. The purpose of the excise tax of 1791 was to destroy and hamper rural regions. Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton was the excise tax's biggest supporter, and he wanted to hang those Americans rebelling against the tax by the neck until dead. Now that didn't happen, but in order to enforce this sales tax, George Washington's revenuers ignored the newly passed Bill of Rights. Washington ultimately put down the Whiskey Rebellion by force, setting the stage for the federal government to tax you any way it wants, no matter how unfair it is. Washington should be considered more a tax tyrant than a loving father of a country. By the way, just like tariffs, we were also promised in 1913 that excise taxes would go away with the modern income tax. But guess what? We still have excise taxes. Review IRS publication 510 for 62 pages of instructions on excise taxes, which leads me to the question and the promise of fair tax. If the IRS administers excise taxes and the fair tax is an excise tax, why would the IRS not be in charge of administering the fair tax? Getting rid of the IRS seems like it's nice, but is it more of a feel-good promise, not backed up with logic or history? Also, a 23% sales tax is completely insane and will result in newly formed criminal enterprises to avoid the sales tax, resulting in massive noncompliance and rewarding those willing to break the law with fortunes they could never create through legitimate means. Just like Prohibition's ban against the sale of alcohol, it greatly rewarded bootleggers the most. The fair tax will benefit those who will make a commercial enterprise at avoiding the 23% sales tax. So in summary, we actually have a battle of three losers. Excise taxes, like the fair tax, lead the government to be able to tax you any way it wants, picking winners and losers in violation of your constitutional rights. Tariffs have historically been used to target certain regions and certain industries to benefit a certain few. And the income tax was a promised relief from both tariffs and excise taxes. But now that the income tax has gotten so bad, we are promised that excise taxes and tariffs will eliminate the promise of the income tax? So, look, let's conclude here. The problem isn't necessarily the mechanism of taxation. Tariffs really can't save us. The fair tax can't save us. Income tax can't save us. But rather, the problem is a federal government that wants to tax us in the way it does. The problem isn't so much the type of taxation deployed, but the type of federal government deploying it. Since 1791, certain people have been punished and certain people have been destroyed. Meanwhile, others are rewarded. So perhaps instead of implementing new ideas, which actually aren't new at all as they were tried before and failed, perhaps we need to implement a new government, one that doesn't have a legacy of 233 years of tax abuse waged upon its citizens that it's supposed to represent. This is Anthony Parent of IRSMedic signing off. If you like this content, please let me know in the comments below. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you know we are going to live to discuss more of the government's endless abuse that the government does not want you thinking about.